He likes to call himself a high-risk politician. No, we're not talking about Donald Trump, but the man who, come Sunday, could become Mexico's first ever left-wing president. Supporters hail Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador as a crusading maverick, detractors as a populist demagogue. We're going to be asking how the 64-year-old former mayor of Mexico City went from perennial loser to runaway favorite. One of his selling points, well, is the rejection of the outgoing PRI party and the corruption scandals that have rocked the tenure of Enrique Peña Nieto. Will the next president fare any better or prove any better at handling Trump's build a wall rhetoric? And then there's Mexico's violence. The exploding homicide rate hasn't spared the campaign. More than 100 politicians have been killed since September. What to do? What should be done about guns, drug lords, and vigilante justice? Today in the France 24 debate, Mexico swings left. With us from Mexico City, he teaches law at National Autonomous University of Mexico. John Ackerman, welcome to the show.
Hello, Francois. Pleasure as always.
From Washington, Antonio Ortiz Mena of the Albright Stoneridge Group Business Consultants. Thank you for being with us.
A pleasure to be here.
Researcher Romain Lecourt-Grandmaison, whose work focuses on criminal organizations in Mexico.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for being with us. And Mexican actor Preciado Rodriguez, who hangs his hat in Paris.
That's right.
Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. A more than 20-point lead over his nearest rival. 3 surveys give him more than half the votes. The latest polls before Sunday's vote couldn't be better for AMLO, as he's called, Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, who's bounced back from 2 presidential election defeats, 2 gubernatorial losses, a 2013 heart attack, and who was on message at one of his last rallies earlier this week in Acapulco.
What we need now is to separate economic power from political power. A government that represents everyone, rich and poor, not like what we have today. The government has become a select group at the service of a predatory minority.
John Ackerman, he's been around the block a long time, but tell us, who is AMLO?
Well, Lopez Obrador has been the most consistent crusader against corruption and inequality for the last 20 years. You know, this is his 3rd time around, but there's a big difference in terms of the polls and in terms of his popular support. You know, you could compare it to Lula's, I think it was his 4th time, and he won. And Lula, after also challenging one after another times and being defeated, Lopez Obrador has finally sort of broken through that glass ceiling, which had kept him around 32, 33%, and now is up beyond 50. There's a generalized crisis in the public institutions and the confidence in government. Never before, at least in recent history, has the Mexican sitting president, been so deeply repudiated by his own people. I think we have a similar situation as to what you guys went through in France very recently with your most recent elections, in which the ruling Socialist Party got 8%. The PRI, our ruling party, is probably going to get around there too, maybe 15, maybe up to 20. But this is a real national referendum, a demand for change. And Lopez Obrador, yes, he's been in the game for a long time, but he's very much of an outsider because, similar to Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, if you want to look at a European referent, because he has not been a part of these system of impunity of corruption. For the last 12 years, he has not occupied a government job. He's been campaigning. He's been running his party. He's been, turned into a real social leader, which has created this great legitimacy, which people are poised to this Sunday, very likely elect him as Mexico's next president.
Antonio Ortiz Mena, how much of it is down to the failings of his predecessor, and how much of it is down to, there is this groundswell everywhere, it seems, for anti-establishment candidates?
Yes, I would say it has to do with the failure of his predecessors, and I would make this plural. So the pre is largely blamed for widespread corruption, and the PAN, the previous government, is blamed for a spike in violence and murders in Mexico, which has not abated. So it's a combination of the PRI and the PAN that, according to many Mexicans, have not governed well. In addition, I would say there is a crisis of political parties in Mexico. Morena, the political party created and led by AMLO, is fairly new. The old parties, the PRI, the PAN, the PRD, which is newer but still much older, are not doing well. So there is a lack of trust in established political parties, lack of trust in the previous leadership. And a lot of Mexicans, I believe, say enough is enough. I'm willing to take a risk, to take a gamble, to try something new. I think that's what's happening.
AMLO famously declared to hell with your institutions after his 2006 loss in a presidential race where his side cried foul. He's since toned down his vitriol, but could still get a little testy, like during the recent presidential debates.
Your approach makes no sense. I'm telling you, I am not corrupt.
Are you certain of that? So what if I show you proof? Would you quit? If I show you the contracts, will you give up your candidacy?
No.
If I show you the contracts worth 170 million, if I show them, will you give up your candidacy?
No, I am not corrupt like you. I am not corrupt like you.
Presidente Rodriguez, what do you make of AMLO?
It is very, very difficult to pick his side for this candidate because, on one side, in my opinion, he is responsible for destroying the left movement in Mexico. During the last 18 years, he's been campaigning, and it seems to me that he's been campaigning more for himself than for a movement as it is. And the result of that is that the whole left movement was destroyed for quite a long time. But at the same time, he has become a social phenomenon that is very amazing. People just follow him everywhere. So one could say, maybe, is it worth to... The question that I ask myself is, has it been worth to destroy a complete political movement that was for quite some time the hope of the people, in order to create a real social movement that people really believe in him and people...
And if you believe the polls, a winning machine, perhaps.
Exactly, and a winning machine that if he actually wins, will this social movement, with this faith that people has in him, will be enough to start fighting corruption and start fighting all the problems that happen.
You have doubts. You think he's in it more for himself.
That's a very good way of saying it.
And yet, full disclosure, who will you vote for come Sunday?
I would say AMLO.
You will nonetheless vote for him, even though you've got your misgivings about him.
The problem is that in this election in Mexico, this and the last 3 elections in Mexico, you don't vote for the best, but you vote for the least worst.
John Ackerman, your reaction?
Well, I'd like Preciado to clarify what he means by destroying the left. At least on the surface, Lopez Obrador has unified the left. This is one of the first times in recent history in which we have, a very clear unity. Even Preciado Rodriguez is going to vote for Lopez Obrador, right? Who are finally looking to achieve, the presidency. Mexico had been left out of this pink wave.
But this is one of the big questions, John. John, this is one of the big questions, and that is that you've got this. He's got a big tent around him, and it goes from people who are very radical to some who are just reformers. Once he's in power, the old saying, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. What will it be like?
Right, of course. That is the big challenge. I think it's actually a wonderful advantage. I mean, so they're all the real concerns, for instance, anti-Lopez Obrador concerns that you kind of put with that clip, is that he's somehow an authoritarian, he's going to destroy institutions. But actually, the fact that Morena, his new party, is so diverse and so plural, it will be a challenge in terms of creating consensus and agreement, but it's actually very positive in terms of democracy because it's going to make sure that López Obrador has to really, rule for all Mexicans, and it's not going to be a simple task just for him to, to say where we have to go and his whole party to go behind him, because that party itself is so diverse. And I mean, the really exciting historical thing about this is that throughout Latin America, almost all the countries, except for Mexico and Colombia, over the last 20 years, have been able to experiment with some kind of progressive left-wing government. Lots of different versions of this, right? You got Kirchner, you got Lula, you got Evo, you got Mujica. Everybody has their favorite ones and the ones they hate. But Mexico hasn't even been able to form a part of that movement. And finally, it looks like we're going to be able to experiment with this in our own way. Of course, López Obrador is no Chavez, no Trump, no Evo, none of these guys compared to him. He's a Mexican who's grounded in Mexican political processes. And I think, the vast majority of Mexicans are going to be really happy and celebrating this Sunday for an opportunity to really try and see whether democracy is going to work, because this so-called democratic transition, which they sold to us in the year 2000, just hasn't taken off, and now we have a hope that this might happen.
Let me turn to Romain Lecourt-Grandmaison on this. How strong are Mexico's institutions right now as we look at this campaign in its closing days?
I think they're extremely weak. Actually, I mean it's obvious that AMLO represents a change. I think John Ackerman said it quite frankly. It's true. Like it's that there is something new, there is something more progressive, there is something different for sure. And at the same time, I think the video of the debate you just showed shows how much the campaign was disappointing to me, at least. How the campaign was focusing on him as a person, as you said. I think maybe it's him who's very good at putting himself as a leader, of course, but the whole campaign was against him as a person. You've seen the accusations on the debate. It's quite ridiculous, to be honest. And I think the whole campaign was disappointing because the Mexican institutions are extremely weak. They're in extremely bad shape, and the corruption is absolutely everywhere. Impunity is absolutely everywhere. So I think that the state of the country, in many different ways, is very problematic. And I think actually the work starts on Monday morning, and that's what's going to happen.
So let's look at his two signature campaign issues. One is to reform the state oil company, Pemex, and give it back its stature of old, feeling that too much of it has been sold off on the cheap to the private sector. And then the second one is agrarian reform. How far will he get in practice?
Well, I think on both reforms, it's extremely difficult to see today what's the margin of maneuver he's got on such issues. I think where it's been very good during the campaign at reaching other people. People were very much against him, saying, "Oh, you will never have the business sector behind you." I think is achieved to get the business sector, or at least parts of it, behind him, which was a big challenge for him. So I don't know how much those very ambitious reforms are actually going to get after the campaign promises, but it's been working in a very, very good way to actually reach more people than he had at the beginning, for sure.
Antonio Ortiz Mena, when you look at those signature campaign issues, will he be pragmatic?
I hope he's pragmatic, but as you have mentioned, he leads a very large tent. So in economic policy, we do not know what he will do. For example, a top Mexican business leader, Alfonso Romo, is his main advisor, and he says that they're in favor of private investment, both foreign and domestic, and that the energy reform will not be turned back. And then on the other hand, he's got other supporters that just want to rip apart the energy reform. Likewise, he talks about driving development in rural areas, in Mexican agriculture, and providing what in Mexico we'll call precios de garantía, or minimum guaranteed prices, which to some people sounds like a command economy, and it raises all sorts of flags. When businesses ask me what's he going to do, I tell them that we don't fully know, because he's got a very a motley coalition, and he's got different people saying different things. My hope is that he will be pragmatic, although I do believe he will be very pragmatic in three very important policies. First, on fiscal policy, I do not think that he will be responsible, tax and spend. He said he would not raise taxes and he would be careful with spending. And his record says that he is a fiscal conservative. Second, on monetary policy, we do have an independent central bank, which is different from many other Latin American countries that have had problems with inflation, such as Brazil in the past. And thirdly, on trade policy and NAFTA that is being currently renegotiated, I don't see any significant differences between the current government and the Lopez Obrador government.
Yeah,
that's where I see things falling.
Antonio, you're one of the people who negotiated the original North American Free Trade Agreement in the 1990s. It's surprising for us looking at this from the outside how little the feuding with Donald Trump over this issue has been a factor in voters' minds.
Yes, I would say it's interesting to see how the NAFTA debate with the U.S. has washed out in Mexico, because all major political parties, including Morena, have a fairly similar stance of NAFTA, which is that it needs to be modernized, that Mexicans have to keep a cool head, but that we will not accept an agreement at any price. Likewise, the issue of the wall that was mentioned at the outset of this broadcast, all Mexicans agree that we will not pay for the wall. So even though it's a very emotional issue, all Mexicans agree on that, so it washes out. My sense is that people will decide their vote on a function of who they believe can better deal with organized crime and with violence and insecurity, and to deal with corruption, and to get higher economic growth going in Mexico. I don't think that either President Trump or the wall or NAFTA will play a big role. You agree with that, John Ackerman?
I think Ortizman is correct, everything he's saying, but in terms of a broader scale, in terms of your question, I think it is important to notice that the Trump effect has been strong over the last year. In many ways, it's kind of woken up Mexicans to realize that we need to, defend our national economy, not in a closed, protectionist, Trump-like way, but strengthen the Mexican economy, because if Trump decides or anyone else decides to sort of cut off the links between Mexico and the United States, then Mexico needs to have the strength of its own to be able to continue forward in a globalized economy. Of course, these racist attacks, the wall, the separation of parents and children along the border, all of this has woken up, I think, Mexican public opinion to a need to have a leader who has a little bit more of a dignified defense of the country. And it's exposed Enrique Peña Nieto. So Enrique Peña Nieto and his foreign minister, Videgaray, have really been, lapdogs to Trump and to Jared Kushner directly. And that's helped sort of to...
But what can AMLO do differently when it comes to dealing with Trump? What can AMLO do differently?
What can be done differently? Well, we're going to have to stand up in a much more dignified way to Trump. So what has Peña Nieto been doing recently, for instance? He's been allowing ICE and United States immigration agents to operate directly within Mexico, and is sharing all information over migrants who come into Mexico with the United States authorities, right? So in Mexican migrant detention centers, they do, fingerprinting and other kind of biometrics, and that information goes directly to the computers of ICE. And Mexico is, has this new southern border strategy and is, imitating, even though they complain, the Mexican government, about the Trump attitude towards Mexicans, Mexico is having, increasingly the same attitude anti-Central Americans. And so that's one very important policy. And in general, the whole question of the drug war, right? So under Peña Nieto and with Calderon, of course, beforehand, Mexico has basically played into this idea of the drug war in Mexico and has been taking in lots of military support from the United States. And what does Lopez Obrador propose? He's even, let's go back to, the Alliance for Progress. He has directly said, thinking about the relationship between the United States and Mexico based on more economic development, infrastructure development, kind of a Marshall Plan for Mexico instead of this militarized strategy. So I think that there are different ways in which Mexico can strengthen itself in its relationships with the United States without creating, a geopolitical crisis. Lopez Obrador is very pragmatic, but he does want Mexico to be stronger, its economy, its national security, and its internal policies in terms of migration. And so we can make some major steps in that way by breaking from this terrible servilismo, how do we call it, servile attitude of Peña Nieto towards Trump.
Before we look more in depth at this issue of the violence in Mexico, Preciado Rodriguez, as a voter, what are you expecting the next president of Mexico? How are you expecting the next president of Mexico to deal with Donald Trump?
Well,
can he do any differently than the current one?
I guess what was just been said is very right. What I would like to see is a much less of this attitude of just saying yes, yes, yes to everything, because that's what we have been seeing for the last, since I remember, to be honest. But I think it is a matter of fact, in my opinion, much more important to deal on the business side of it, looking at the NAFTA, looking at how the business side of it is going to help the next president to deal with the U.S. with that. And the immigration issue is a complete different, to me, that looks more like a human rights issue than a business issue.
Should Mexico be cooperating with U.S. immigration authorities?
Of course. Every country that has a border with another country has to cooperate.
All right, Mexico on track to finish 2018 with around 30,000 homicides, the country's deadliest year in at least 2 decades. None of the candidates have published a detailed plan for changing that. This, as running for office, whatever the level, proves for some a deadly endeavor. Peter O'Brien explains.
It's an election marred by violence. Since campaigning in Mexico began in September, there have been more than 500 attacks on politicians. 130 of these were killings, and among those dead are more than 40 candidates and shortlisted candidates for state and local elections. Several have already been killed this week, days before Mexicans go to the polls. Among those, Emigdio Lopez Avendano, who is running as a state representative for Oaxaca.
Justice needs to be done for him and his children. He has very small children, not even 2 years old.
Victims are from parties across the political spectrum. Though few cases have been solved, authorities suspect drug gangs are to blame. No wonder security is a priority in this election. There were 30,000 murders in the country last year, the deadliest in its modern history.
I want another life for my children, so they don't have to live through what we're going through now.
Murders so far in 2018 have increased 21% over the same period last year. The presidential candidate in second place says homicides are a direct product of Mexico's 12-year war on drugs. Politicians say they will make peace a priority, but the methods differ. The front-runner has said he'll give some criminals amnesty, while the last-placed candidate has proposed chopping off the hands of corrupt officials. Some 30,000 posts are at stake when Mexicans go to the polls on Sunday.
And by the way, one think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, has established what it calls a Mexican Peace Index, MPI it calls it. Its map of the country shows places where killings sometimes reduce growth by double-digit figures. And if we look at that map, Romain Lecourt-Grandmaison, we see certain states in particular hit more by this trend of homicides. Is it fair to say it's directly and tightly bound to the drug trade?
I think you have on this map, if you compare it to 6 years ago, for example, from the previous election, you have new states, you have new municipalities that came out within the top, let's say, top 10, top 5 most violent places in Mexico. So of course you have places that are related to drug trade, but I think it's very hard, and I think that there is a huge need for a change in the whole narrative about what's going on in Mexico and about
some
about
places
the
have
drug
become,
wars.
like Yucatan, have become less violent, according to
Yeah,
their-
of course. Yeah, I mean, you have some places that have become less violent. Some places have become more violent. I
So
think
why?
the whole issue, I think, is that we don't really know why. We don't really know why they become less violent or more violent. Because the truth is, I think we know very, 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 very few about what's going on the field in Mexico, because you don't have a proper justice system, you don't have investigation, you don't have police investigation, so you don't really know what's going on. So you have places in Mexico that have very, very bad figures about violence today. People say, oh, it's the drug wars, it's the drug gangs, it's the drug cartels, it's because it's on the way to the US, it's because it's on the way to a port, it's because there's always a very good explanation, a very general explanation about it. But I think we don't really know the complexity about it. And I think Baja California has nothing to do with Guerrero, for example. It's two very different places. It's completely different dynamics. Of course, you have people and you have businesses involved in drug trade, drug violence, drug cartels, of course. But you also have a very strong collusion with the state, with political violence. I think what you just mentioned in the video is this. I mean, it is political violence, and the usual explanation is always, oh, it's the drug gangs, it's the drug wars. It's the complete explanation that everything is what's going on in Mexico. I think it's too simple.
Okay, so no simplistic explanation as to why there's the violence, but what about why there's the spike in the violence? Why so many killings this year?
I think you have two things. You have first, in Mexico, usually the years before the elections and the electoral years are the worst in the statistics. So unfortunately, I think it is because you use violence within politics to impose your decisions. And of course, in that sense, the drug gangs, the cartels, the criminal organizations, they push their own agenda. I think they push political agendas for other candidates. So you have a congregation of political, let's say, investments, political interests that want to change something, that want to influence in the election. And just one thing, I think in Mexico you have violence and you have killing because you can kill in Mexico. You have an almost 100% rate of impunity in Mexico. There is almost no way that you're going to end up in jail or in court, maybe in jail, but never in court actually, for killing someone. So you actually kill someone because you can kill someone in Mexico.
John Ackerman, cleaning up the police, cleaning up the judiciary, mission impossible?
I think our colleague there is hitting the nail on the head. I think this is absolutely right. The real problem is the relationship between the government institutions and organized crime. People often make the comment that the real organized crime in Mexico is not the drug dealers outside the government, but the crime which is inside of the government. The government itself, which organizes the crime. And that's why in electoral years, things get so chaotic, because you have one government leaving, another one entering, and they're jockeying around for different positions, both outside and inside of government. And so this promise or commitment by Lopez Obrador, for instance, to separate the public, the government, and the private spheres also applies, of course, to narco trafficking. We need to have, government public institutions separate from these criminal networks, and that would make a major difference. And of course, the issue of impunity is at the core of all of this. As we just mentioned, only 1% of all crimes are ever punished. But this goes back to the fact that the citizens don't even denounce crimes. Only 9% of 100 crimes that are committed are even reported to the authorities. And so having a government who could actually be trusted by the people and then actually investigate crimes and bring people to justice could make, it would take a while, but could make a real transformation. And what has Lopez Obrador particularly proposed in this issue? He's talking about precisely this, changing the narrative. Let's not talk about war anymore, fighting fire with fire. Let's talk about strengthening institutions, making citizens participate, and that, it won't be overnight, of course, but that's the solution, not the solution that's been used by Calderon and Peña Nieto under pressure from the United States, which is militarizing public security, creating new federal police. We now have our new gendarmerie, modeled on the French model, supposedly by Peña Nieto. That was going to be the solution. Well, it's totally failed because that's not the solution. We need to go back to basics in terms of society participation and strengthening institutions and the investigation of crimes.
Antonio Ortiz Mena, you agree?
I agree that we have a huge problem and that it didn't get enough attention during the campaign and the debates in terms of specific proposals. For example, I agree that we need to change the narrative, but we also need to change the policies. And I didn't see a lot of specifics. And let me give you one example. Should we just continue to do what we're doing while several U.S. states are liberalizing the consumption of marijuana? And just last week, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, to a great extent, also liberalized the consumption of marijuana. These are integrated markets, so we have to be very, very smart in terms about how we disrupt markets, how we disrupt supply chains. I guess more intelligence, more big data, more financial tracking, and
the legalization of marijuana, maybe.
I personally think that, done carefully, that would be the thing to do. More of the same will result in more violence. And a lot of politicians in Mexico and in the U.S. are scared to say this policy has not resulted in any measurable success. We need to try something different. And yes, I'm in favor of that.
Reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. If economy and violence are the main issues, why would Obrador be so dominant? Only anti-corruption drive can explain it. But of course, is the violence one of the factors?
Yeah, of course, the violence is one of the factors. And I completely agree with what Antonio is saying, and John as well. The problem is that it sounds to me just like theory. In theory, it sounds very well, but you go to Mexico and everybody's corrupted. The cop that works in the traffic, he's corrupted. His boss is corrupt. His boss is corrupted. Everybody's corrupted. So there is the real problem that if you're trying to clean the system, how are you going to clean it if the money flow, which is actually what causes the corruption, is completely free because there's cash flowing around all the institutions?
Is it getting better or worse right now?
In my opinion, it's getting worse.
And why is that?
I don't know why is that. I want to believe that it's because, for example, no crimes are denounced because you've just lost faith that something is going to be done about it. So you try to solve it by your own hand. You try to avoid going to the cops. You bribe someone because it's gonna go faster, etc., etc. So,
Romain Lecourt, Grand Maison, what needs to be done to strengthen those institutions that Mexicans no longer believe in?
Well, I think there is an important issue about going back to what's going on locally. Really to trying to understand what are the dynamics at the local level in order to actually know what is going on, so you can actually design and build an actual effective response to what's going on in Mexico.
It can't be top down the way it is in France.
I think it can't be top down in Mexico today because, again, I mean, you have 32 states in Mexico. You have violence, of course, in Baja California, in Guerrero, in Yucatan, but those states have very, very, very few things in common, actually. The dynamics, you have to adapt the strategy to the dynamics on the field. And if you design a very top-down strategy with what Peña Nieto was supposed to do He said, "Oh, we're gonna topple the previous model, which was the federal police model. We're going to kind of import the gendarmerie from France." He tried that for not even 2 years, and then even the project almost disappeared. But I think the top-down strategy is a failure. I mean, it's been 12 years of a failure, and I think it has to be changed. The whole strategic has to be changed.
Antonio Ortiz Mena, your reaction when you hear their Presidio describe how so many are losing faith in institutions?
Yes, I think that institutions are very weak. To go back to the discussion we had earlier, let me give you an example. There is less trust in the electoral institution now than there was a few years ago. There is less trust in the electoral tribunal, which included a pretty controversial independent candidate, than there was a few years ago. And the same goes, of course, for the Attorney General's office, the Interior Ministry, which is in charge of domestic security issues. So I would say that there is an institutional devolution in Mexico, both in terms of their functioning, performance, and public perception. I would like to see whoever wins the Mexican election on Sunday to have a very aggressive program on strengthening institutions and making them more independent. We need more independent and professional institutions like the Federal Competition Commission or several regulatory bodies that deal with the energy industry. Nobody accuses them of being corrupt. Maybe people don't like the policies, but they do well what they're supposed to do. We need more independent and well-funded institutions. This is also a budgetary issue, a priorities issue.
All right, well, we're going to, of course, continue to follow it up to the lead-in to Sunday's vote and to debrief it afterwards. I want to thank you, Antonio Ortiz Mena, for being with us from Washington.
Thank
John
you.
Ackerman in Mexico City, Preciado Rodriguez, and also Romain Lecourt Grand Maison.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Our World Cup Daily is next. Mexico losing but going through to the knockout phase, by the way.